Wow. Allora, buonasera a tutte e tutti. Good evening. It's actually our first talk in English of the series of events that accompany and highlight aspects of the exhibition Roma a Portrait, hosted at the Palazzo delle Esposizioni, and we're very, very excited to have with us Laura White, who's one of the artists that presents her work in the show, who has proposed this amazing talk that I was really, really looking forward to. And we have together with us Rebecca May Johnson and Rachel Roddy. So I will give a little introduction because I had a lot of fun researching on these three ladies and reading the writings. So it's a conversation about food, but also a lot about materiality, and also words are material, I think. And then each of them will talk for 10 minutes and give a presentation of that work, and then we open up conversation. And I'm pretty sure that both here and there will be questions and dialogue and conversation, because every time there's something bubbling in a pot, conversation stems, and kitchens are very much part of what makes our lives very special, I think. I've been hearing about both Rebecca and Rachel from Laura. I also see in the audience Lisa, who's been another very important partner in crime in the 9 months of residency that Laura White had, which to me looked like a dream from her writings and from the Instagram, has been like exactly how I think you should use a residency: searching, exploring, and trying out new things. A few words about our guests. Rebecca May Johnson is a writer who addresses the role of critical practices in daily life, and for example, food and cooking are part of it. One of the things that I love is that she has a PhD in German literature, but she also, and she's currently publishing essays, reviews, and also nonfiction. She was a creative writing fellow at the British School at Rome in 2021, and this is another link with the British School at Rome, who has been generous in sharing with us this event. Rebecca is also an editor at Vittles. I subscribed this morning, and which is a food and culture newsletter based in UK and India. And you write Dinner Document, which is a newsletter which contains recipes, podcasts, and stories. And I subscribe to it today as well. And you've been recently publishing Small Fires, an epic in the kitchen, which is a memoir, which, as far as I remember, or as far as I guess, yesterday was out in US. Yes. Yeah. Okay, so congratulations. So we're also celebrating this bit. Rachel Roddy is a food writer and photographer and cook, and she's been living in Rome from 2005. She's the food editor of The Guardian, and your texts are actually often translated in the Italian Internazionale, which is how I met your writings, basically. And I would love to read in Italian, I'm afraid, this small presentation that I found of you, which makes a lot of sense, I think, in the frame of the exhibition too. It says, dopo aver fatto il giro di 2/3 della costa siciliana, ho preso un treno, una nave, sono arrivata a Roma, in un quartiere che si chiama Testaccio. Ho assaggiato per la prima volta la ricotta di pecora e ne ho scritto. Ci sarebbero altri dettagli, ma questa è la sintesi e l'essenza di quasi tutti i pezzi che ho redatto sul cibo italiano da straniera. Sono arrivata, ho mangiato, ho scritto. I really love that condensation of, like how as a foreign you arrive, you taste, you try out things. It's pretty much what we try to frame also with the exhibition on landscape. You also have a blog, which is called, I can't read my writing. Rachel Eats. And you're the author of 5 Quarters, which is a super Italian thing dalle, recipes and notes from the kitchen in Rome, which won the Andre Simon Memorial as Best Gastronomic Book in 2015. And you also wrote A to Z of Pasta. Quinto Quarto is also translated into Italian. And we come to Laura. Laura White is the Ampersand Foundation Fellow at the British School in Rome from September 2002 to June 2023. And her work focuses on the interaction with materials. And I have to say, like, it was immensely interesting to me to look at through materials, through the eyes and through the understanding of Laura. Laura has an interdisciplinary approach, working with sculpture, installation, drawing, writing, and fieldwork. And fieldwork is workshops, of which you've done a few, formal, informal, also with Lisa, with Erika Meyer as well, at the Villa Massimo. And the trait d'union among all these workshops is about also touching. Like when you sculpt, you touch material, but also when you cook and also when you eat. It's like there's a special pleasure in eating with hands sometimes, I find. I also was amazed at the fact that you extended your knowledge on the material world, participating to a lot of courses. For example, you can use taxidermy. You can blow glass. Yeah, you can make dresses. And you can make a lot of other things, including bread and cheese. And I will leave now the floor to Rebecca May Johnson and also the microphone.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that lovely, generous introduction and overview of what we're going to be doing today. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with Laura and Rachel. I'm a huge fan of, long-term fan. I don't know what that phrase is actually. Anyway, I'm a long-term fan of Rachel in all regards. Anyway, writing and as a person. And I love Laura's work. I visited her studio earlier this year and was electrified with thinking and all sorts, seeing the sculptures that she's been producing during her residency. And we had a very exciting conversation, I think, which partly led to today coming about. There's lots of points of contact between our work. So, oh yes, my slide's up. My one slide, enjoy. So I'm going to do a bit of talking, and then I'm going to read a bit from my book, Small Fires, An Epic in the Kitchen, which was published in America yesterday, which came out in the UK last August. And then I'll be handing over to Laura. So I'll get going. Okay. Yeah. What kind of thinking is cooking? What form of knowledge does a recipe produce when it's performed? I'm going to read a few excerpts from my book, Small Fires, An Epic in the Kitchen, in which I investigate these questions by writing about cooking the same recipe 1,000 times over a 10-year period, and by subsequently conducting experiments in the kitchen with sausages. Cooking became part of the writing process and shaped the writing of Small Fires. I moved back and forth between the page and the kitchen as I wrote the book and tried to capture what was happening. To write about the knowledge produced and understood through the body, also my body, I had to stay with it and allow it to speak. Okay, so I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from the prologue in the kitchen, and then a bit about the recipe that I cooked 1,000 times, more or less, when I'm still cooking it. 10 years or more learning to think and to cook unfold in separate spaces, officially at least. I am taught that the work of critical thinking takes place outside the kitchen. That's on my German literature PhD. And that cooking in domestic space is not connected to the endeavour of serious thought. It is an exclusion that has limited the shape of our ideas, an imaginative drought, a half-light. If food and thinking coincide, I was taught, it is in an image of men who have been served dinner, talking face to face over the table. Slowly, I realize that when I cook, I am also researching the relationship between the body and language, between self and other. I am learning how to think against a rationalist and patriarchal history of knowledge. This book is a document of that realization. A text that allows cooking into the frame of critical inquiry, and in which critical inquiry is shaped by cooking. This does not mean exchanging the kitchen for the library. My clothes must become spattered with oil. I've never met the person who wrote the recipe, but it is recommended to me on a newspaper website by a cook who has been recommended to me by another cook whose judgment I trust because I have tasted her food. The route to the recipe is made by tongues. It is by far the cheapest and easiest recipe in a feature about famous chefs' favorite recipes, but it is precise in ways I do not expect. During my first performance of the recipe, I have a revelation about ingredients or vegetables. They are things. I must learn to watch them closely, ready to accommodate their whims, which are not human. The recipe is a method for responding to things. Things have agency in many directions. Like words, they have histories and contexts. But when I perform the recipe, things become other things in a messier transformation than words in a sentence. They spatter my shirt red. The recipe is a text that can produce spattering because it was spattering before it was language. Language is only a holding pattern for the recipe, not its origin nor its terminus. Spattering is not mentioned in the recipe. The text does not anticipate the liveliness of the process it describes, which spatters wildly. The substance in the pan trespasses beyond its linguistic boundary, making marks or mark-making on my shirt, the wall, the dry surface of whatever book is close by. There is always more. There is more than has been recorded in the text, and there will be more again. Things will be hotter and redder. There will be spattering. In some ways, the recipe text gives me no clue about what is to come. This is hard to forgive. But after cooking it 1,000 times, the recipe turns out to be good enough. It holds me and survives my many attempts to destroy it. The second, third, and fourth time I make the recipe, I follow the instructions as precisely as I can, reverent and still wonderstruck by the transformation of matter in which I am a participant. My body is changed by the recipe. After tasting it, I see flavor differently, which means I see things differently, because flavor is a quality of things, or can be. And it's not seeing, it's tasting, but it's a tasting that inaugurates a different relationship to things, a new method of perceiving. It is not the surface I am looking at. I'm learning to see into things, into the dimension of being that is flavor. There are so many possibilities. Each time I encounter the same thing, the same ingredient, I find that it's different again, and so the recipe is always a method for seeking. Turn the heat down to very low. On the 8th time of making the recipe, I do not add fresh herbs at the end because I've run out of money. The herbs cost more than the rest of the ingredients put together in the small urban supermarket near where I live. It is less fragrant but still intense. It tastes redder. For my 12th performance, several months later, I'm exhausted from working until 3 a.m. in a pub, and I have missed the closing time of the last pizza place that delivers in South London. I decide to free pour the oil instead of measuring it spoon by spoon. Even while tired, I feel the frisson of resistance to the text's specificity, and have a small conversation in my head with the author of the recipe where I explain that even though I have not measured the oil, it's probably almost the same. For the 21st performance, I change the preparation of the garlic, and I don't slice it very thinly as the recipe instructs. Instead, imitating the movements of a man I've recently met, I crush it and keep crushing it and crush it with a knife until it is almost a paste, which turns out to be quite difficult and annoying to do. And the taste is different. My tired wrists know the extent of my deviation from the method. The change in method means I can no longer see when the garlic becomes coloured a pale gold, as the recipe text directs. So I turn to my nose for navigational purposes. This different way of preparing garlic is brought on by a kind of blindness called desire, which drives me off my intended course. Cutting and slicing is not a matter of dividing one thing into smaller fractions of the same thing. After cutting, it is not the same thing. In Harold McGee's Encyclopedia of Kitchen Science, I read that in the case of garlic and other alliums, when cells are cut, an enzyme trigger is released that interacts with chemical ammunition to produce a pungent sulfurous molecule designed to deter animals from eating them. The taste which attracts us should read as poison. The enzyme reaction in garlic produces 100-fold higher concentration of molecules than other alliums. Slicing, pounding, and crushing do not only change the physical shape of the garlic clove into smaller pieces. Each method alters the very chemistry, the very being of the clove in a different way. The clove cannot be reassembled or returned to the clove it once was. Form and structure is a matter of being, too. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'll keep going. In the book, cooking is a creative practice, and a practice through which I theorize, and a writing practice. I spent a lot of time wondering how to access the cooking that thinking is when I was writing, because the thinking that cooking is does not necessarily resemble the thinking that I had done in the library while studying a PhD in a contemporary rewriting of Homer's Odyssey by a German poet. Halfway through writing the book, I got stuck. I got entangled in words and philosophy and theory. There was a kind of monster chapter in the middle where I got sort of lost in a sort of morass of abstraction. And I thought, why am I here with the books when I need to go back to the kitchen? And so I went into the kitchen and I cooked some sausages. And that was, in fact, to test a theory put forward by the psychoanalyst, some of you may be familiar with D.W. Winnicott, who invented the concept in the mid-20th century of the good enough mother, of which many people, including many mothers, have been quite some fan. Anyway, but he wasn't such a fan of recipes. He, in fact, hates recipes, and quite irked me, because I was, when someone you love their thinking and then you find out that they have an opinion that upsets you, I needed to investigate. Anyway, he says that cooking from a recipe can only be a slavish experience, that's his word, from which you can gain nothing but a feeling of having complied with something. And unlike in his psychoanalytic writing, where he rigorously kind of works with patients before he arrives at a theory, with cooking, he feels it's fine for him to just speculate and have a theory with no proof. So I made myself his patient and cooked the sausages that he refers to, which is Mrs. Beeton's sausage recipe. I feel like there's something Freudian going on there with Mrs. Beeton. Anyway, I tried to annotate my experience by cooking the sausages as closely as I could, writing hastily by hand, trying to stay with the feeling in my body as I was cooking as much as I could to capture the experience and to get away from this sort of abstract hell that I'd got into while writing. And after that point, I wrote the rest of the book by hand, and I became quite attached to the idea of writing as mark-making and kind of accepting the kind of gestural quality of writing, also kind of aligned with cooking. I'm almost done, I think. Yeah, sorry, I don't know how long I've been talking. Anyway, so a few more questions that I pondered when I was writing the book, which always seemed challenging to answer. When is a recipe? It's located in the gesture of the person who makes it first, or is it in the text which annotates those gestures, the recipe text, or later when someone follows it? It's quite hard to really know what you're talking about. Where is it? If you get into the sort of state of quantum physics. The subject of inquiry moves between the gesture, the material ingredients, the text, over and over again through time. Also, where is a recipe? That's kind of bound up with that question. The location of a recipe is impossible to know in its totality. It's always being eaten and washed up, of course, as well. But it is made for dissemination. It's the study of the recipe is a study of pure reception, of lived interpretation, a philologist's nightmare. A recipe gives many hands the power to transform matter. But all those hands and all those transformations cannot be known all at once. What an infuriating thing for people who like to know origins of things. As such, a recipe becomes a chorus, a siren song of those who have performed it. It collects their lives and those insights into itself. You cannot return to the original dish from which the recipe was perhaps first transcribed. It cannot be known. The recipe that I make 1,000 times or more is attributed vaguely, and this is my Roman connection, by the American-Italian food writer Marcella Hazan to people who pulled hand carts into Rome. So it's pasta alla carottieri. I don't know if I pronounced it right. Carottiere. Sorry, I should have written that down. And so the performance of the recipe became my focus when I was writing. The recipe as a score for performance. I began to see my performances, my cooking of the recipe as a way to think about returning life and the body to language, to the text, over and over again, enriching its language with new material movements and new semantic threads. Maybe I'll just read 2 lines now from the end of the book, which I feel like expresses that sentiment. If I can grab it. Oh, yeah. Outside, the wind is roaring, the turbines are turning, and in the kitchen, the air is singing. The air is singing Marcella. It is singing garlic, tomato, turning sweet and intensifying. The oil is becoming redder, and it is breaking free and spattering the sides of the pan. The fragrance in the air has become a siren song. The edges between things have blurred and become indistinct. There are not singers, there is a chorus. Thank you. The spattering sounds that you heard when you came in and that you can hear, oh no, you're still hearing now. Oh no, by my friend who's a theorist of music and a musician called Samuel Wilson.
Okay, hi everybody. This is a great pleasure to be here with you two and Cecilia. Cecilia, because she curated the show, which has been amazing to be part of. Rachel, who I've been stalking before I came to Rome and got here, was managed to meet you and spent lovely time cooking with you and getting to know you. And then Rebecca also, which I love your book, and I've just reread it and found a whole different level to it recently. So thanks for including me here. So I'm going to just introduce myself a little, as Cecilia's done really nicely already. But I've been here for 8 months, and I'll be leaving soon. I'm doing a fellowship at the British School, and I have a piece of work in the exhibition Roma Portrait called Disobedient Bodies, so that's in the show. I'm going to talk about my practice in relationship to my interest in food and how this has evolved during my time here. I have a slideshow which will play in the background, and it has really its own intuitive logic. So things will make sense and things will not make sense. So if we start the slideshow, and then I'll start. Great, okay. I have a materially engaged practice that cuts across a studio practice, primarily sculpture, writing and fieldwork. My practice focuses on process and how objects and things come into being, with an emphasis on the handling of materials, from stable materials such as ceramics and concrete to the changeable matter of clay, bread dough, salt and rusting metal, exploring and responding to the material behaviours and my personal relationship to them, alongside their historical and social contexts. It is important for me to be led by my materials and to collaborate with them, rather than imposing myself on them. I'm drawn to the materials and processes that challenge me physically, materials that are difficult to control, awkward to stabilize, and resist being fixed. It is important for me not to plan what I do, but start a journey with a material and see where it takes me. Being exposed to breaks, mistakes, and failures of materials to open up new directions and possibilities. Food has for a long time been an interest and inspiration for my work, in particular exploring hands-on engagements with food. Food is a shared experience, whether you are cooking or eating. It is a day-to-day material engagement that we all relate to. Maybe not in the same way, but we all do it. Even if you don't like cooking, we all handle and eat food, peel an orange, break bread, experience food passing through our bodies. Food is a very physical thing, and whether making pasta or sculpture, I'm engaged with the materials I use, how they feel, smell, and behave. Whether a material stretches, breaks, cracks, how far can I push them and how far they can push me. Rome has been a food journey for me, and I've immersed myself in it. Not just hands-on making, but looking at the production, display, and consumption of food. Spending hours in markets, bakeries, salumerias, and delis, looking at fresh and packaged produce, watching people prepare food, cutting vegetables, slicing and portioning meat and fish, and passing of goods from producer to consumer. I have been learning food processes such as handmade pasta and pizza techniques, and cheese making through the eyes and hands of food experts, and spend my time reflecting my eating experiences in restaurants, in the markets, and on the streets, all of which gets digested and absorbed into my studio practice and writing. To extend my skill set, I often join courses, and over the years have done classes in patisserie, chocolate, cheese making, sushi, fishmongery, butchery, baking, and pasta. It is as much about learning skills as also refusing them. Learning to make hand-rolled pasta recently, I found myself once back in my studio using the skills I had learned, but also rejecting methods that were taught in order to find my own way of handling the material. These courses are for me a fantastic place to unlearn as well as to learn. I am doing many things here in Rome with food, such as cooking with Rachel in her home, learning about bees and honey produced by Erica Meyer, who's the beekeeper at Villa Massimo, and cooking with artists in the small British school kitchen, and collaborating with artist Lisa Deichwich, whose name I pronounced probably incorrectly. I've been practicing that. Lisa is an artist at the German Academy, and we are meeting every few weeks to cook together. We have made traditional Italian bakes such as fognatelli and castenaccio, and explored the innards of lamb to make corratella and sausages. We've made garum, pasta, bread, jam, and lots of other experimental food with a range of locally sourced ingredients, pushing and challenging our skills and learning from each other. I take processes from food production as well as other hands-on skills, implementing them into my art practice. I've been working with dough here in Rome to make sculpture. Dough is an amazing and awkward material to work with. It's elasticated, robust, unstable, and changeable, like working with a living organism. Salt goes some way to harden and preserve this uncontrollable matter, but it has its own life, and I've learned to collaborate with it. I've developed a dough mix, flour, water, and salt, plus a few other ingredients to make it more stable and flexible, making sure for it not to lose its doughy qualities, its ability to stretch and be springy. Dough is handled in many different ways across cultures for making bread, pasta, flatbreads, plus so much more. It is a language that connects people. One of the reasons I like to use materials such as dough is for its accessibility, its cheap and humble ingredients, flour and water, that are familiar and everyday, opening up an empathy and physical connection between artworks and viewer. All materials have unique qualities, so spending time with the material, handling it to learn from it, is important for me. I explore the material and my own body together. I never plan exactly what I will do. Mixing large batches of dough, I use my entire body to stretch the material. Each batch behaves differently, as my recipe is never exactly the same. Placing a mass of dough across my body as I lie down, I use my legs and arms to stretch the dough. I use its weight and gravity to pull and shape it as I pass it over my arms and hands. There is an urgency to this process to keep it in one piece, but beyond that, I'm open to what occurs. It's always a surprise. The experience of working with dough is incredibly visceral and sensual. The smell, the temperature, and its liveliness to move independently. After stretching it, I place the dough in a position, perhaps over a box or a chair, to leave it to dry. It may take weeks to go hard. Whether I'm cooking or making artworks, my head, cognition, and hands, physicality, are working together. This is not a linear experience which can be articulated wholly through words, but an entangled one, a product of so many things. I'm interested in looking at materiality as the subject, rather than a vehicle to describe the non-material and theoretical. It is not easy to put into words the exact actions that will bring into being, say, a single tortellini. It would depend on the maker's physical body, previous experience, emotional state, and the environment, the room, the temperature, the furniture, such as the height of the table you're working at, others in the room, conversations, atmosphere. And then there is the complexity of the material, the ingredients, their material qualities, where they are sourced, how old, how much, not to mention the political and social historical context of both materials and their handlers. Hands-on making is complicated, and yet as we do it, knead dough, roll out pasta, it can feel like we are not thinking, just using our hands to shape and form material. It's a beautiful dance between the hand and head. Using dough as a medium, I have been both making dough to make sculpture and also pasta dough for eating. One is made on the table and the other on the floor, although I feel the pasta on the table is probably as much sculpture as those on the floor. I apply and shift my hands-on skills and techniques from one experience into the other, stretching, rolling, tearing dough on different scales with different intentions. Food to sculpture and back to food, with thoughts about value and food consumption, alongside a sculptural language to want to capture in the material emotion and action, residues and reflections of the body, my body. Somewhere before, between and after the table dough, floor dough, cooking, eating and visiting food producers, I have been writing. I published short texts on my website called Tenderfood, which is an ongoing project that explores materiality through a digital space. Writing is another way for me to delve in, unpack, and experience from a different perspective my encounters with food and other materials. You may see in my dough sculptures a fascination with the Baroque, such as the sculpture of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, my folding dough resembling folds of carved marble. Rome has been an amazing place to study Bernini's work. I'm interested in the collision of different materials and their associations, such as the relationship between pasta dough and stone. Bernini was quoted to have said he was making stone as obedient to the hand as if it were dough. Connections between the everyday material of dough and the valuable marble of Carrara are understood to both having unique material qualities. By bringing these two antithesis materials into the same arena, manipulating dough beyond its familiar culinary use by shaping it into folds, capturing it in motion, while being compelled and guided by its awkward material nature. I hope my sculpture communicates to an audience this fascination I have with the material world. Oh, bit of pasta.
I wanted to pass it on without talking.
Thank you. Oh, thank you for such a lovely introduction. And it's, yeah, as Laura and Rebecca have said, it's lovely to be here. And having spent time
with both of you over the last few years with Rebecca, in the case of Rebecca, but with Laura, cooking together, and then having seen your work next door, and Rebecca, of course, we've cooked together a lot over the years, and I feel now that we cook and write together. I think I need to get my bit of paper. Have I got? Oh, here she is. This is Ardeboni, which is Il Talismano della Felicità, which is a classic Italian cookbook with a post-it that I hope will make sense later. When I was about 8, when I covered all my school books in sticky back plastic. I remember being very good at covering my books in sticky back plastic and being very excited by sticky back plastic, so much so that I covered anything that I came across with sticky back plastic, including my brother and my sister's books, and I think some of my mum's books. I don't know if anyone else did it. I was very pleased with how neatly I did this and how well I was protecting my books. And one of the things I protected was my mum had a file of recipes in the kitchen. It was a brown paper file, and in it had things she'd ripped from newspapers and recipes that she'd written on index cards and recipes that other people had written. I suppose these are from probably the 60s and 70s. This must be about 1980, 1981. Anyway, I organised her recipe file, and I remember that the newspaper cuttings, I cut them neatly, and then I did the sticky back plastic so that you could wash them, you could wipe them. And then I stuck other recipes in a new notebook that my mum still has. Also, I was quite careful to make sure I snipped out any comments that my mum had written. This was very good, or this didn't work so well, or this was 2 ounces instead of 4. And also often who had given my mum the recipe. And one of these recipes I remember particularly well is a marmalade cake by a neighbour called Frida Coleman, who I think, although my memory is not very reliable, not that that's ever stopped me writing stories, used to live in the bungalow opposite. And Frida Coleman's marmalade cake was margarine creamed with caster sugar, flour, baking powder, 2 eggs, and then you put 2 tablespoons of marmalade in the cake batter. You baked it. And then when it was cool, it was a loaf cake. You then made an icing with icing sugar, more marmalade that you then, I think people say drizzle, but I think I would say zigzag, this and the icing on top of the cake. I'm telling you this very long story because I remember being of course we were eating that marmalade cake, but more than the cake, all these recipes, I remember being, as an adult I would analyse it as saying being fascinated by these recipes. As a child, I just remember being very interested in these recipes as little stories. Not that I called them stories, because they were absolutely packed. Now remember, this wasn't recipes with lots of information around them or particularly stories. It was measurements, but in them they were absolutely stuffed with people and places, and of course very bodily sensations, because I loved this marmalade cake. And actually the thing about this marmalade cake was that if you picked the icing of it, which we did as children, if you were really clever, you could pick the icing off the next slice too. So you could effectively steal the icing from the person and eat it all at once. And I remember this sort of recipe book and this being a very enchanting world, and I would sit and I would read these recipes and stop. And then I did other things with my life. I left home, I did various jobs, I went to drama school. I always wrote, and I always enjoyed reading recipes. But I felt that the two were very separate until I came to Rome in 2005. And when I came to Rome, I was keeping a diary, as I always had done, and I was writing, and I was also understanding where I was through recipes. So I was reading a lot of recipe books, including Ardeboni, although I should say at this point I had absolutely no Italian. And struggled massively to even get a quite basic grasp of the language. I was living in Testaccio. I was living in a very edible part of the city, which actually is shaped like a piece of cheese, quite conveniently. And I was keeping a diary of where I was, and then I was eating, and I would go and I would find the recipes in books that I didn't really understand. And it was then, at the same time, I remember seeing a food blog online, food blogs that people often to be quite rude about. But anyway, I remember reading a food blog, and I remember it being a story and then a recipe, and I recognised it, and I found it familiar, and I thought, that is what I'm going to do. It was what I recognised from childhood. I thought, there it is. And what I thought it was a container. This recipe was a container for all the things that I was experiencing. So I was experiencing. It's all the things, I wish I'd made notes when you were talking, Laura. It was that the social and the economic and the historical context. It was the new place I was in. It was the people I was in. But then above all, it was the physical actions involved in making a recipe. So I began writing a blog, and I began writing stories. But it was then in about 2015 when I'd realised that actually what was the most important part of what I was writing was actually the recipe itself. And this was the set of quantities, the set of instructions, because actually that was the story. That was where I was beginning. And then later I would write a story. Surrounding it, I might expand on the history of the dog. But essentially what I was doing was that within that set of movements, and it was a set of movements, I was then building my own story. And also what I was doing was, because I was cooking, and remember I didn't speak particularly good Italian, because I was cooking and I was writing, and then subsequently I began doing this for The Guardian, get quite a dry mouth. In fact, when I get nervous and I can't find the words for something, I go into the kitchen and I make a recipe. And actually, because I'm nervous now, I think what I need to do is I need to return to a recipe. And I think what I need to return to is the tomato sauce on the wall. Well, actually, no. Actually, I'm gonna improvise here, because I'm going to talk about this week's recipe in The Guardian, which is courgettes braised in tomato sauce. So I think a lot about a recipe. My job every week, I've written a column in The Guardian, quite extraordinary, for 8 years now. Every week, I write a recipe in my columns. That's 416 recipes I've done now, in which I suppose what I do is I invite people to cook with me. And they do, because actually the thing about writing for a newspaper with a comment section is that there's an engagement. Because actually, in the beginning, cooking was about me, and I suppose in many ways it is about me. But actually, what cooking now is about is it's about other people. Because what I want is as many people as possible to engage in this practice with me. So I spend a lot of time thinking about recipes. And what I think about a lot is I've always thought of recipes like as if they are like sponges, that you can squeeze them very, very small and have minimal words. I mean, how few words could we? If I said to you, soften onions in olive oil, add tomatoes and salt, and cook until done. Put basil at the end. Is that enough? What if I said, take 3 onions, slice them, and then soften them in 6 tablespoons of olive oil, and then watch them until they turn translucent? I think a lot about the sort of information I need to get somebody else in order for them to then make this recipe, to make themselves something to eat. And I suppose what I need to do here is I maybe need to invite Laura or Rebecca in with me to sort of talk about this, because I suppose what we're talking about is we're talking about an engagement, that we're talking about recipes, but we're actually talking about an engagement with this set of instructions that then contains everything, doesn't it? As little or as much as we want. I mean, I have no control over how somebody interprets these instructions that I give them. I mean, sometimes I worry endlessly about whether I'm giving people enough information or whether I'm giving people too little information about a recipe. Sorry.
Yeah, my mother is the kind of person that gives too small an information. She's the queen of cubi, quanto basta. And listen to the sound and you will know it's done. And like, Really. But that's how I started cooking, like trying desperately to grasp from gestures. That brings me to connect with Laura, interpretation that connects me to Rebecca, doing it for myself, which is also something that I read in one of your writings, in your pieces. It's like something that you do for yourself, no? But also trying to understand how to convey the recipe to, like, to make it something that engages, which connects to what you're saying. So I did, while reading your writings today, your different writings, I did see a connection between the three positions that the three of you have, and also the three kinds of very different writings that you have. And I imagine similar but different approaches to food.
Well, I think it was, and I think what I was going to ask about, because when you were talking about making, Rebecca, about making your tomato sauce 1,000 times, I think we talked about this probably. I think I've made tomato sauce 1,000 times, but also how we sort of pass that container on as food writers, and how sort of useful that can be, and also how useful, you know, what is most useful in order. But you said to me, Laura, with your work, you know, you have, you know, you present the work and then you have to leave it there.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I'm not a cook, so when I go to a recipe as cooking, then there's a kind of wanting to be fixed around the recipe. And I think what I've learned working with Lisa, we've done a lot of cooking together, and I realised that the recipe is just this starting point. And when there's no pressure and there's not an event at the end to somehow produce this for anything important other than friends, then it can just be a starting point, and it becomes this thing that you give to somebody and they have a go. But every time you cook it, I imagine it's different. Like, my husband's cooked many of your, but sometimes they're a disaster and sometimes they're not, and he follows them stringently. So it is, I think it's very much about where you are, like I was saying, emotionally, how you're feeling. And the thing that I've noticed working with Lisa is that we have these really relaxed days, and somehow non-pressure, being relaxed and being open to make mistakes and use a recipe as a starting point, which I'd never thought about before. I thought that it was the way. Then you can start to have fun with it. But I'm sure you two are at that point, because I'm earlier on to the cooking experience, whereas my sculpture is very much in that bit, that it's I mix things up and then I see what happens, and it doesn't matter whether things go wrong. So I'm at a kind of different stage, the relationship to materials in sculpture, than I'm with cooking, I suppose.
To go back to the question of interpretation versus strict following, once I did I think last year, I did a workshop with 30 translators all over the world, you know, in South Korea to LA to Egypt, for the Emerging Translators Scheme, which is something that runs in the UK. Anyway, I gave all these different translators the same recipe to cook. In fact, it was the tomato sauce recipe that I write about in my book. And it was a way for them to sort of think about their translation practice. They're all literary translators. Some have, you know, won, you know, the International Booker Prize and whatever, you know, from a different angle. And some of them are quite pissed off about being asked to cook a recipe, especially ones in regions where it wasn't so easy to find basil necessarily. Anyway, but what was quite interesting is that all of them cooked the recipe differently, and it made them realize how much they change a text in their translation practice as well, even without realizing it consciously, sort of interventions that were being made on an emotional level, or kind of almost like a gestural level, the kind of physicality of language in that kind of translation process. When they looked back at what they did versus the recipe text, they realized how many changes had occurred in that transition. But nonetheless, I suppose, as Rachel, you're saying, there was enough information there to hold them, to give them that space in which to play, in which to deviate, to express, for their body to speak. I suppose if there's not quite enough information and you don't have enough knowledge already, it can also be a sort of terrifying experience as well, where everything feels like chaos.
Yeah, I think, I think also the other thing about writing a recipe, you say, with the sort of chaos or the splattering, I think when going back to the cake recipe, that's where I sort of got lost in myself. Going back to the cake recipe and remembering and seeing when I was quite little that recipe was associated with a person and a place. And also a very specific set of, I suppose, 9-year-old emotions. Now, actually, one thing I didn't say was that actually when blogs sort of exploded in about 2005, something I would read constantly would critics of blogs who would, you know, sort of accuse them of being amateur or boring or, oh, you know, get to the point, like get to the recipe, like why on earth are you telling us the story of Vera across the road? And actually, I remember, and that's a valid question, but actually, what I was trying to do, or they were trying to do in order to get to the recipe, was giving people useful information, also openings, whether that be, I mean, I read blogs that were deeply scholarly and philosophical, and blogs that were geographical, and blogs with profound social history, and also a lot of blogs with marmalade cakes, of which I was happily a part. But, you know, but also the very best of them mixed that up. But it was like being given, recipes were like openings, felt like opening doors on possibilities. And then around the emotional relationship with recipes, I mean, it is incredibly sort of tedious, but actually those emotional triggers and those physical triggers that I think more than anything, you know, food in literature has always felt to me like an invitation. Also because essentially it invites an active, you know, we're never more vulnerable than when we eat something. You know, it's the sort of active engagement. So yeah, it feels like an invitation, and that's why therefore the detail is an attempt in which to engage the reader in some sort of, I don't know, quite visceral and possibly messy and possibly painful, because, you know, a lot of our associations with recipes, actually, I mean, the problem with a Guardian column is that really I just want you all to make my biscuits and be very happy. But of course, actually, a lot of the time cooking is not happy at all, is it? It might be wonderful. I mean, you know, especially in Italy, you know, there's a lot of talk of, I mean, one of my columns that received more comments was the one where I sort of talked about cooking and being in a really foul mood. And, you know, and I mean, the comments were extraordinary, as people said, well, you just can't possibly cook without love. Like, that would make you a sort of awful person. But actually, I'm a half good and decent cook, and actually I cook in a furious mood a lot of the time, and I think a lot of people do. But it's quite difficult. I mean, I feel in a dilemma, because really I'm the milky tea of this group. You know, I'm really just want you to make my biscuits. But actually at the same time, I do try to introduce this idea. You're not milky tea. But, you know, introduce in not a happy ending.
Laura, I was just thinking about mood and what we've just been talking about, and you're talking about, you know, your sculptural media laying under a blanket of pasta dough and all these things, and I'm wondering how much you feel that the material becomes a sort of memoir medium or an autobiographical medium through this engagement, because your body is.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a large-scale cooking tortellini. I mean, it's like, I think all those emotions are, like you're saying, there's times when you're in a bad mood when you're cooking, where it's the same as, obviously, I'm going through these emotions if I'm making my work. But I think the way that I'm focused around one material, I'm not pulling a number of recipes together, so I'm totally engaged with this one thing. And I think it becomes really bodily, and I think when I'm in the psyche with it, nothing else really matters. I mean, someone asked me yesterday, why don't I record when I'm negotiating this dough? But you know what, if someone was in the room, it wouldn't be the same. I'm very aware of my breath, I'm very aware of what I'm doing, and I lose myself in it. And, you know, it's not a thing that has to be eaten, it has to be a thing that I'm engaged with when it's done, but there isn't the pressure for it to be consumed, or the pressure for it. There's other types of pressures, I think, when you're cooking. It's got a taste. Mine can go anywhere, and they can be utter failures, and then a week later when they break in half, they become something else. So they come from a similar engagement maybe, but they go to a very different place, I think.
And they don't have to be pleasing.
Yeah.
You know, in a sort of, you know, they don't have to be pleasingly consumable or pleasant or whatever. Well,
I was thinking about that when you were in your book talking about giving the pleasure through food. And I was thinking, well, there's an audience for a sculpture, for an artwork. And that thing about that containment, you're giving someone a recipe, and then you're taking that away. And I'm thinking, where does that fit within an art practice? Of course, you put it in a gallery, then you have a audience and a viewer. And that's the best thing, that people come with new stuff and new ideas and new readings of the work. And that brings back into the work, and then you go off again with something. So it has that openness. They're not physically engaged with it in their own way in a kitchen, but they're taking them maybe psychologically or emotionally or somewhere else with the work. So I love that thing where there's that letting go, both through a recipe, but also through the artwork when it gets into a gallery space.
I remember, Laura, when you were talking about a talk that you gave at BSR. I think you were halfway your residency, and you said that while talking about your work, you gave each person that was in the room a little bit of dough to play with the hands. And I think that there's a lot of your work that conveys through this kind of engaging both the mind, so like this non-bodily experience of the work that a viewer makes of your sculptures, but also bringing back to touching and eating, it was like and swallowing. So there's a suggestion of it, which is like also inviting for another engagement that you share with Rachel and Rebecca, and at least there's an allusion to it.
I think also it's that thing, because we were talking about how when you're making something and you're not necessarily directly talking to someone, it's the conversations that happen when you're in that space of making. And the thing you're referring to was like a show and tell. I gave everyone some dough, and I asked people not to speak and just play with this stuff, and see and everyone does something different. And that's what I'm really interested in, is that you can give someone the same thing and everyone engages with it in a totally different way, which is like the recipe. Everyone's going to interpret that in a different way. But I think that I really enjoyed when I was cooking. I was nervous coming to your house the first time to cook, and then actually we just started making and doing stuff. And then the conversations just occur, and silences are accepted. Like, it's very difficult to sit around a table and be silent with people you don't know, but when you're cooking, you can. And then we started watching each other's hands and how they were working. So, there's this lovely thing when the speech disappears and the silence comes in and the handling takes over.
And it's also a different kind of speech, because the body is speaking through the gestural language of doing in the kitchen. And sometimes it feels, when there's a nervousness, when, with a new person or something like that, there's a great sort of physical anxiety as well. And what are you going to do? How's your body going to betray you in some way or speak? And I think sometimes giving it that structured activity, like playing with the dough or cooking together, creates a sort of another kind of dialogue that's going on, that then speaking with language is easier to go into. I don't know why I'm just rambling now, but anyway, what you said just made me think that.
When you were talking, or you were recounting about your experience with cooking with Rachel, and while also reading and what you're sharing with us today, it really always reminded me a completely different experience, which is also very similar. I used to, I very often end at a table of another artist, sculptor, and there's very often a piece of clay, and you very often pick some pieces and you start doing bits and bits, and that normally ends up in a piece by her. It's very similar to like being invited to a table and started making pasta, and then like the gestures, and then you appreciate the silences, and I think it has to deal with matter, which is very much the thing that you were bringing into your text and into all the text, the thing, right? And how to make it. So the recipe is also a way to invite you to make a set of gesture and engage with the matter more than the final, like the cake or the biscuit in itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's a starting point, isn't it? For me, when you make pasta, you probably have a pretty much idea of how this thing's going to look. But when I start, I don't sort of think about that. I sort of think about how the form might take me. So I'm trying to unlearn and not try to think about the form it takes at all. But the thing that I'm realizing now more than anything else is the way that we all three write, and I'm not a writer, not like you two, but it's a very everyday, day-to-day entrance into doing something. And when you were talking about how that's, you know, I read your recipe books like novels. I may not even make some of the recipes, I just read them because I feel engaged with where you are when you're doing this. And it's such a great invitation. And I think it's that very down-to-earth, everyday material engagement that we all can relate to, and you do it with your writing the same way. You know, it's like I'm with you with it because it's not pretentious, it's not highfalutin, it's totally something that I can relate to. This then makes me feel relaxed to be part of.
But it's also an imaginative space for thinking about process and investigating, you know, even if you're not going to make the recipe, but you're reading it and you're imagining the processes and you kind of almost begin speculatively investigating them in your mind. And I was reminded recently of the speculative function of a recipe or an instructional text recently in sort of world building, the kind of world building aspect of a recipe text when I was reading Yoko Ono's book, Grapefruit. I don't know how many people are familiar with it, but it's a set of instructional texts or event scores from the Fluxus movement. But it lots of the texts in it read like recipes, but many of them are impossible recipes. But although there are many instructions in there for making a tuna sandwich as well. But it also reminded me of the sort of world-building imaginative potential of a recipe as an instructional text as well, even if you're not going to make it, you know, like what you're saying, you can imagine yourself into the space, but also to imagine more things, I don't know. It's like an exciting, I found that, the recipe text is an exciting proposition in that way.
Well, also, I mean, it can be, there's, I was thinking of Roddy, the Italian children's writer, you know, and his sort of magical, fantastical recipes. I mean, a recipe text is the potential for everything, isn't it? I mean, that's what I think. At the best, it can be a story, it can be a set of instructions, it could be a fairy tale, it could be, you know, it can be made up, it can be filled with sort of science or chemistry or history. I mean, for me, you know, that was why I read Montanari, who writes about food. I mean, his work is a vessel for, you know, deep philosophical thought and also great humour. I like that dance. That's what I strive for, the sort of dance between I don't know, information, practical, and then I hope a sort of deep sense of goodness and humour as well, which is always essential to everything. You know, if it makes you happy at the end and makes you laugh, even better.
Yeah, and when you taste a new dish for the first time, it is like inhabiting a new space as well, and you experience your body and the world in a different way, like in a fairy tale. In a way, it is a transformational experience, and especially when cooking your recipes, Rachel, which is so wonderful. Well, yeah, that's the other thing about recipe writers. They're always trying to pass off the credit to someone else, which is also a nice gesture because it is always a collaboration. But yeah, anyway, you've got to claim your own work as well.
We're opening to questions, and I'm gonna leave these ladies with this microphone. And this is my favorite thing, to be here and pass the microphone. So please, someone take it. Yeah.
Hello, I missed the first few minutes of the conference. I don't know whether this was already mentioned, but what are your feelings about Instagram on recipes, and especially on the presentation of food and the pressure it puts on the home cook to present this wonderfully presented dish? I actually hate that part of Instagram because it messes up the whole procedure, the whole process of making food, which is messy. As you can see my kitchen, it's total mess, but then I clean up afterwards.
A spacious, you know, recipes are you want to make them also as accessible as possible, don't you? That's the idea, you know, expanding. I mean, essentially, we learn from recipes, don't we? I mean, you know, maybe you learn from your mother or your sister, or you learn by watching somebody, or maybe you learn from the page in a book. But essentially, you know, the idea of whoever is providing the recipe is making it as generous and as accessible to everybody. And if you know, to limit it to the sort of aesthetics of a very neat kitchen and a very perfect plate of pasta, to me seems a pretty sort of limited scope. So in that sense, no, I'm not a fan. I'm big and wide, which is why I'm always better on page anyway.
Yeah, and I guess some images of cooking and recipes on Instagram are very kind of commodified and neat. However, there is also reactions to that in people displaying their messiness and different ways of living also on Instagram, but maybe they're the ones without the massive followings, I suppose, because it's more in people's small kind of everyday ways of being. But yeah, certainly I think people do feel pressure and anxiety around sort of having a certain level of living which may feel actually unattainable financially, etc., which the internet conveys, lifestyle. It's depressing.
Well, I guess this is a follow-up question. So, thinking about the aesthetics of food on Instagram, because I feel like before Instagram, at least I'm 26, we had like Tumblr, which was very much kind of like more like the origins of like messiness in blogging, and just like the internet being a place where you like unleash everything you wouldn't present in person. And so going back to the Winnicott also, and like Instagram, and whether we're representing our false selves or our true selves online, I was wondering, like, do you think there is, like, is there more value in kind of sharing those sort of like more diaristic entries, those things on Instagram? Is that just not a space for it at all? Will you just get like buried under other content? Since you're writing a book and you're writing a column for The Guardian still, like, what do you think the sort of future media space that's like best sort of fit to host those kinds of entries, like how to share those thoughts and those images, I guess?
I can speak now partly as an editor of Vittles, which is a food and culture newsletter which has quite a big following, and an ever-growing following, and we pay our writers really well, and unlike many publications. And we also have images, and I just started commissioning recently a new column called Cooking from Life, which is specifically to capture that messiness of life, and we are inviting people to give a real messy, complex portrayal of their domesticity. So today we published one, for example, by the writer Sean Fay, which has the headline, "Why is the thought of cooking so dreadful?" and ends with a recipe for Weetabix, which has in fact provoked quite a significant amount of debate on the comments. Anyway, so I would say, you asked about the media futures. The newsletter format has been a very significantly emerging way that people are able to write in their own voice, convey more complex portraits of their domesticity, and also in some cases earn money from it too. Although, you know, the algorithm and capitalism always finds a way to make money from whatever you're doing and re-commodify it. So, you know, who knows? But I mean, I'm no media expert, but I'm just speaking as far as I work as an editor. We actively seek to commission more complex, uncommon pictures, images and words from people. So whilst there is the kind of normative force of platforms like Instagram, new platforms can also offer other ways of presenting things. But I don't have a solution.
But you think there's a substantial audience that will read a newsletter?
Yeah, we have a huge number of subscribers, and because we pay people solely through subscriber funding, and we pay £800 for a piece of writing now, which is certainly more than most newspapers these days, and that's because there is an appetite for complexity. Lots of our writers are first-time writers, and many of them our writers from backgrounds that who don't get a hearing in the mainstream media, put it that way.
Sort of a follow-up, but do you think that the aesthetic quality of food is like inherently important? I think like outside of media, like a purely from like the personal and consumptive aspect.
Do you think it's important when you eat?
Yeah,
you eat?
Very much.
Well, I mean,
because I consider also creating a plate like a visual art form as well.
I think you answered your own question there.
But I'm also interested in other.
Oh yeah, of course. But that's a good question. I mean, Rachel, do you think? Oh, sorry. To just reiterate that. Then, do you think the visual quality of food's important?
Well, yeah, I mean but of course it's arbitrary. I mean, because one person's, what one person thinks is beautiful, somebody else might not. I mean, I write a weekly column with a photograph, and actually, unlike the rest of the supplement, I take my own pictures in Rome, which is cheaper and easier. And we have a mixed reception of those. Some people hate them, and some people like them because they say, well, I feel I could make that too, which is, a sort of compliment. But of course, yeah, I mean, it needs to be appetizing. But I mean, it's interesting because actually the food books that I grew up with, I'm 50 now, didn't have photographs. And actually I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, cookbooks as valuable social documents, again, something I didn't say before, recipes as receptacles for history and geography and social science and are valuable documents and are held in cookbooks, and of course cookbooks still sell. Unlike other areas of publishing, there's still a huge amount of money, and of course a cookbook that costs £25 or £30 because it's filled with colour photos, hugely important for publishing houses because people still buy them, so the aesthetics of cookbooks is hugely important. But again, it's difficult, isn't it? Because again, what do you find beautiful? I mean, personally, I'm very happy with cookbooks without pictures. Because
yeah, that's my conception. I remember my mom's cookbook, just all text, very thick, like a very fat novel. And now every cookbook is like sort of like a magazine instead. And I think
I was just going to say something which is totally different in that when I make pasta, because I'm not selling it and I'm not bothered about it being in that area, it's like Lisa and me have been cooking and making things look very bright and very scary to eat, and actually one of the things I've been doing is trying to make pasta that's too big for the mouth. So you have to really negotiate it. How do you get this thing from the plate into your mouth? How do you chop it? Like pasta, usually you get a fork, maybe a spoon if there's a broth. And we made some very large pasta a couple of weeks ago, and I was adding food colorings in order to make it look more meaty. Like it looked like some kind of thing swimming around, like a bit of gut or tripe in a broth. But I'm quite interested in sort of asking people to experience something that perhaps doesn't look good, and that sort of association, what you see is not what you taste, and how do you get something very big into your mouth, and then do you become more aware of what your tongue's doing, what your teeth's doing, how it passes through your throat. So I'm a totally different thing about aesthetics. It's also it can be a very different experience that's not in the same realm, I suppose.
I do gain a great deal of pleasure from arranging food on a plate, given the opportunity. But I can't say I'm necessarily greatly skilled at it. But it is a compositional practice. Making a meal, assembling things, arranging them on a plate is a compositional practice. And everyone has a different approach to that, whatever it is. But it is one.
Fabulous trio of talks, guys. Great. I keep thinking, obviously, about gender, and what Laura just said made me think about a kind of form of insurrection. In other words, that you refuse to make something pleasing and domestic, and instead you make something that disrupts that. And I was thinking about the kinds of recipes that I come across in the sources I work with, which are from the 16th century, which will sometimes be shared between women, and it's a recipe to ensure that the newlywed's first night with her husband works right, for example, or a recipe to help somebody conceived the right gender baby, and these are written into letters between women, and so it's a way that the recipe becomes a form of communication which is subversive and underground and resistance. and I can't help feeling like, you know, what's happening here is in a sense an embracing of a form of communication that women have had for centuries because they haven't had the library, and then turning it into something that's both deeply pleasing and aesthetically amazing, but also insurrection. I didn't know if you wanted to comment on that, or perhaps that's just me reading that into it.
I love that idea. That's really cool. I'm reminded, or I would love to read those things. I'm reminded of, what's it? Is it in Ovid? Also women using like weaving to sew. There was something cut women's tongues out and then they wove the message of what happened into the sleeve of something. So again, I mean, I'm gone away from cooking there, but using a kind of domestic skill as a form of communication, which then ended up actually in the child being cooked and fed to the child was cooked and fed to the man who cut the wife's tongue out. So that's a kind of combination of those things. But I think, sorry everyone, but
I was going to say as well, the other thing about it, of course, is we've talked about, I've talked about sort of writing recipes down, but of course, in passing that recipe on, I mean, you then have no control whether that recipe could be, somebody could write it down for somebody else, but of course, a lot of recipes, like you say, are still passed verbally. You may, on the one hand, you would tell someone, actually, if you can do that, you can use, 2 tins of tomatoes, or you could do that and you could use a squidge of tomato puree. But these little, we pass on, I don't know, sort of messages and ways of doing and ways of being. I'm always interested, often people will give me huge amounts of feedback about my recipes and will say how they've adapted something. And actually often in comments will say, well, people don't, why are you telling Rachel all of this stuff? But actually I'm intrigued. I made it this way because it fed my family for a week. And I think it is often the conversations that women have around food, and men, but I think those domestic conversations that are weaved through the lines of recipes are fascinating.
Yeah, and also giving the appearance of doing what's expected of you whilst also at the same time performing an insurrection is just a wonderful thing. And just because of my PhD, I'm obviously reminded of Penelope, who's appearing to be weaving, but she's secretly stealing her time back for herself. And that really reminds me from what you just said. Yeah.
Sorry, a comment more than a question. I don't know if you've heard of an Italian pasta recipe which goes by 2 names, well actually 3. One is it's just got butter and Parmesan cheese on it. It's not pasta Alfredo, however, and it's pasta burro e parmigiano, and some people might like to have olive oil instead. In Umbria once it was known as pasta all'inglese, maybe I thought some poor English bloke who was a bit queasy or something. Latterly, only a few years ago, I've heard that it's actually can be called la pasta dei cornuti or del becco, which is the same thing, meaning the pasta that is for the cuckolded man. So this made me think about the insurrection. The poor lady hasn't got time to come up with a fancy recipe. What's easier to just pour some olive oil or parmesan and on the pasta, and lo and behold, you have lunch, and I've cuckolded my husband.
Yeah, he's not getting the roast chicken.
Everybody is thinking to this pasta. Like, did I have it? Why? Okay, if there's no more questions, I would say that we can thank Laura, Rachel and Rebecca very, very much for this super interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for your questions as well.
Thank everybody for bearing with us, and thanks for the resistance from the kitchen. That's the subtitle of the conversation. Thank you.